on Wednesday night, as hopefully that will start to take shape here soon. Before we get started with our Bible class tonight, we do have a few things that we need to remember, our announcements. Don't forget that the Children's Homes truck will be here on the 18th. Remember to check the bulletin for our list of sick. Brian Lafferty especially, as he'll be has been doing tests this week, and we'll see about if they are able to do surgery. We want to keep him and Helen in our prayers, as well as those that we know that have been dealing with difficulties and loss of loved ones. We're going to start a new series that we'll be studying this quarter, looking at the nation, the man, the people that would be called Israel. And we're going to start tonight in Genesis chapter 32 and verses 22 through 32. So if you would get your Bibles out and turn to Genesis chapter 32, we'll start in verse 22 in a moment. It's probably one of the oddest passages in the Bible. I remember when I was growing up, we would be at services, and I don't, maybe you're this way, but sometimes the preacher just doesn't have your full attention. And when I was younger, that happened to me more often than not. But my mom wouldn't let me pinch me, poke me, whatever, to keep me attention. But the one thing she never questioned me on is if I would be reading a Bible passage. And my mom's Bible, it had a section in the front of it that had like interesting facts about the Bible, interesting passages in the Bible. And one of those were some odd and unusual events in the Bible. And I don't know how many times I would look at that and read one of those passages. And I remember reading it as a young person and thinking, what a strange series of events, what a strange happening, what strange questions come from it. And it's easy sometimes when we come across texts that are that way to just say, well, we'll just, skip over them, right? But the problem with this one is, it is a pivotal moment in the Bible. Everything changes in its focus and in the events that would shape human history in this passage. So let's go ahead and read verses 22 through 25 of Genesis chapter 32. It says, "Now he arose the same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children, and he crossed the fords of Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream, and when he sent across whatever he had, then Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him." Now you can see maybe why this is listed as an unusual passage. It's random wrestling. Now, you put a bunch of boys in a room. We always have this at camp. We leave a bunch of boys in the room in the dormitory, and if you don't watch them real carefully, you know what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes? They're going to start wrestling around, right? They're going to start throwing each other around, and that's just the nature of them. But here are seemingly 2 grown men who are out in the middle of nowhere, staying up all night, wrestling one another. Why in the world is this happening? Who is this person that shows up, and why is it so significant to be included in the text? Well, we might need to look at the context of the overall story to figure out what's happening here. The story is talking about Jacob the patriarch. You may remember the story of Jacob begins when he's born with his twin brother Esau, born to Isaac and Rebekah. These 2 sons would be battling from the womb, and eventually Jacob would trick his brother out of both his birthright and his blessing. Well, he didn't really trick him out of his birthright. He sold it away from him on the cheap for a bowl of stew. But he definitely conned his father out of the blessing, pretending to be his brother. And then when the ruse was found out, he's on the run, supposedly going off to his mother's people to look for a wife, but in reality, trying to get away from his brother who's set to kill him. He eventually goes to his uncle Laban's, and while there falls in love with a woman. But Laban proves to be just as wily as Jacob, and not only gets him to marry the woman that he loves, but her older sister as well, and has him work for him for 14 years, and those become his 2 wives. Well, eventually Jacob is able, through what he thought was his own trickery, but it was actually the blessing of God, to develop a sizable flock and sizable cattle and goods and such, so that he was a power in his own right. And eventually decides to leave Laban, and he does so kind of in the middle of the night and sneaks away. Of course, Laban comes after him, and when they finally meet together, they both kind of reconcile, but you can tell it's kind of one of those things of Laban catches him basically to say, I knew what you were doing. Jacob tries to feel like, oh, I wasn't doing anything. But eventually they part on good terms. But the problem is now that he's leaving Laban, he's got to go back home where he's terrified of what his brother's going to do to him. In the first verses of chapter 32, we read that when he comes to that way, the angels of God meet him. God sends his messages in the next verse. This is God's camp. This is God's place, his company. This is where God is. So to Jacob, this has got to be a message that sounds good, right? God's presence is here. But the problem is so is his brother Esau. And what we see in that next verse is that he was worried. He sent messengers to his brother Esau. Messengers that says, hey, I just want to let you know, I'm coming through this area. I've been with Laban, but here I'm coming back, and I have all kinds of oxen and donkeys and flocks, and I'm just telling you this so that I might find favor in your sight. Well, he sends that message to him, and immediately after, this is in verses 4 and 5. In verse 6, the response of his brother is, he's coming to meet you. Now, if you're Jacob, how do you take that line? Hey, I'm just letting you know, I'm going to be in the area. I'm going to come see you. Well, knowing how he left his brother, you could tell why that might make him nervous. And in the next few verses, we see Jacob going to God in prayer. It says in verse 7, he says, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. And he divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 companies. For he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the company that is left will escape. The first thing Jacob does is divide his forces. He divides his company. I can split them apart, so whichever one he attacks, at least I'll get away with half my stuff. He's worried. And then in verses 10 through 12, he prays to God. He prays to God to ask for his protection. God, you said that through my descendants that you were going to make me prosper. They were going to be too great to number, and well, now your help. Verse 11, deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. He will come and attack me and the mothers with their children. God, I need your help here. I'm in a tight spot. He's already got his mind working, and that's kind of the way Jacob is. He's a schemer. He's trying to figure out what he can do to get out of this. And so he comes up with an idea in verse 15. Actually, in verse 13, it says that he spent the night there, and he selected from what he had for him a present for his brother Esau. He knows Esau's coming to him, and he knows Esau's probably mad, so I've got to come up with a way to calm down Esau. So he starts by sending these caravans towards him. He gathers up his goats and his rams and his camels and all these things, and he puts them in groups, and he tells the people, he said, I want you to head towards him. Send one group, and then another, and then another. And every time you meet him, I want you to say, hey, this is a present from your brother Jacob. And see how he responds. And it's basically almost like he's going to send a bribe. And he's going to send another one, and another one, and another one. He's basically saying, how much is it going to take before I can get him to calm down before he comes to see me? And every time they go, they say, behold, this is a present for you. And a second and a third, and all these droves, he's trying to do this. And in fact, he does all that, and he stays on the other side of the river with his wife and his kids until finally he even sends them across, and he stays on the other side. Basically, I'm going to send everything I can to meet him and calm him down before he actually has to see my face. And that's where we come to our scripture in verse 22. So what's that about? Well, this man, when he appears, could possibly be Jacob's worst fear. Maybe this guy is an assassin, come to kill him. Maybe he's a spy to come and report back to Esau. Whoever he is, Jacob wants to know. And he's not going to let him get away. He wants to find out about this man. Who are you? What are you doing here? And that's where the wrestling match starts. And it goes to the point where even when, in verse 25, even when Jacob gets severely hurt, he won't give up. He basically, breaks his hip. Now, he didn't break it. He says he dislocated it. He basically touches him and causes that to fall out of joint. So, you would think that would be a type of injury that would stop him. But Jacob refuses to let him go. In verse 26 it says, but then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Now, here's where the event gets a little stranger. This person has touched the hip of Jacob, and in doing so has dislocated it. Now, do you know what the name Jacob means? If you go back to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 26, when Jacob is born, it says that he came out clutching the heel of his brother. He was already trying to pull his brother, get ahead of his brother, right? And the word that Jacob's name is, it means heel. But it also has another meaning. It's one of those, it sounds similar to another word that basically means literally means to trip up by grasping at the heel. And it would come to mean someone who observes someone who takes something away. But it literally was talking about this idea, you think of, remember those things you used to do when you were in 3rd and 4th grade? You have the guy crawl behind the guy, and then you push him and he fall over. Those kind of tricks. You trip somebody up as they're walking, you stick your foot on the back of their heel and they slip up. That's basically what Jacob was, and that's what his name was. He had been that thorn, he'd been that heel to everyone. Well, now, when this man, he asked for a blessing. Now, maybe thinking, what does that mean? Well, it basically means he wants this guy to not be against him anymore, but to give him something. He'll let him go if you give me something. So he does, but he doesn't give him what he was expecting. He gives him a name. You will no longer be Jacob, but you will be Israel. For you have means literally prince or chief. He went from being someone who was someone who would trip you up, someone who's underhanded, someone who's trying to trick somebody to get something, to now he's the prince. He is the chief. He went from the usurper to the one who's now on top. It's funny because if you're a fan of professional wrestling, you know what a heel turn is. A heel turn is a term that's used for a good guy that goes bad. He makes a heel turn because the heel in wrestling is the bad guy, the villain, who everybody's supposed to root against. Every once in a while, the hero will do a heel turn. He'll become the bad guy, and it's shocking and everything, right? Well, here's a heel turn for Jacob. Except he goes from being the guy on the bottom to the guy on top, the one who's who's the underhanded schemer, to one now who is the prince and the chief. The term here is connected, though, to God. He's become God's choice, which is very interesting when you consider the next verse. Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. And Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved." You see, when Jacob asked him his name, he's now not just some spy from his brother. He's something different. And you see that in his response. One, he calls this place, "I've seen God face to face." He asks his name and he says, "You can't even understand my name. It is too wonderful. Why is it that you ask my name?" We see that term is used later. I always put it in this passage. Over the years, many people have wondered who exactly was it that Jacob was wrestling with. Was it another one of the angels that showed up? Was it something more? Was it God in the flesh himself? Text doesn't give us a clear indication of that, but it does tell us that this person was representing God, and Jacob sees it that way. I've seen God face to face. You see, why this passage is so significant, why it matters so much, is because right here is where Israel starts. Jacob becomes Israel. He has known that God has made promises that have come to his forefather through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, who's now Israel. But at this moment, things change. This man and the nation that would become from him and the people who would come out of that nation now become the focus of God's story. The book of Genesis starts with a worldview. It's creation. It's the flood. It's everything about how mankind came to be. And then it begins to focus down to one man, Abraham, and his descendants. But now in this moment, we see that plan, that purpose given to Abraham becomes something more. God had promised Abraham he would make him a nation. His descendants would be like the seas of the seashore. But when he dies, Abraham owns a funeral plot, and he only has one son that God says things are going to come through. His other son he doesn't even know where he's at. It's just Isaac. And even with Isaac, we don't see all these kids popping up and all this future. It's still the same thing. He has the two sons. But now we have Jacob being turned into a nation. And his 12 sons would become the 12 tribes. Those descendants would become the very people who we see come out of Egypt, conquer the promised land, develop into this nation. The people who would make a covenant with God, the people who would break that covenant and face the people who would be brought back, the people from whom the Messiah would come. So why is it that this man is selected? Now I want you to think about that. The Israelites, the nation of Israel. Why do we call it that? Why don't we call it the Abrahamites or the Isaacs? I mean, that's who they're from, right? When you look at the New Testament, they talk about who we have as our father. They say Abraham, right? We have Abraham as our father. That's where this all starts. Why weren't they known by Abraham's name? Why did they become Israel? Of all the people so far, Abraham was something, right? And Isaac. Isaac was faithful, but Jacob is the uncle that you say, oh, crazy Uncle Jacob, right? Jacob's the member of the family that you don't say as much about in your history, right? Abraham, boy, Abraham did all this. But Jacob, I mean, well, he conned his brother out of stuff. Well, he's been living with his uncle till he tore off out of there. Now he's trying to bribe his way back into his brother's good. Jacob is not, he's the con man of the family. But yet he becomes the namesake. Why? We think about, people we would name our country after, right? People whose name we want something. You don't want Benedict Arnold. But you have Israel. Because he has fought with man and God and prevailed. He has striven, he's wrestled. When we look at Israel, Jacob, we see a very flawed person. When we look at his descendants, we see a very flawed people, flawed nation. Yet somehow God chose them and God used them. Later on in Romans chapter 9, as Paul is writing about the fate of Israel and what will become of it under this new covenant, he brings up the point that, this all started because that's what God chose to do. In Romans chapter 9 and verse 10, we read, not only this, but there was Rebekah. Also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. And through the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand. Not because of works, but because of him who calls. And it was to her, the older will serve the younger, and as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I hated. Why Jacob? God made that decision before Esau ever sold his birthright. We look at especially in the New Testament, and see how Esau is portrayed, and we don't get a good picture. Sometimes we feel really bad for Esau. Well, poor Esau. His brother was always taking advantage of him, starved him out, stole his blessing. The New Testament writer is a little harsher on him because it says he despised his birthright, sold it for a meal. He was a godless man. But before any of that happened, when they were still just tiny little fetuses in their mother's womb, before any of that, God said, I'm going to choose Jacob. And through him, I'm going to bring this promise. Though he's the younger, the older one will serve him. I'll show a love for him. I'll pick him. I'll make him special. Why would he do that? Go back to Genesis. Remember when we said that Jacob prayed to God because he was so worried about what Esau was going to do to him? I want you to notice how Esau words that prayer. Esau may not have always been the most upstanding person, but he knew how things worked. Back in Genesis 32, let's look at verse 10. He says, I am unworthy of the love and all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become two companies. God, I know when I left this place, I wouldn't have anything. And now look at me. And it wasn't because I was worthy of it. I was unworthy of your love and faithfulness. Jacob knew that God had blessed him when he wasn't really worth about being blessed. And maybe that's the reason. Maybe that's why when we look at Israel, we see something that God is trying to tell us. Because it wasn't that they were the biggest or the best or the most faithful. It wasn't because they had a pure moral sense about them, or they always made the right decisions, or if they made the wrong decisions, they would come back on their own accord. It wasn't any of those things. In fact, what we see is a people who get into trouble, beg God to get them out of trouble, and then go right back into the thing that got them into trouble. And we see his descendants making the same mistakes. We see the flaws. We see the things that they did, the errors that they made. And yet we wonder, why would God put up with them so long? And even when he finally decides, okay, they're going to get what's coming to them, he still keeps his promise. He still uses them. He still blesses them. He still brings them home. You see, Israel wasn't special. It's not that God chose them because they were so much more faithful or any of those things, but it was rather God was showing who he was through these people. If he can take Jacob and make him into a great nation, if he can take those people who were faithless and bring them into the promised land, if he can bring them back from their own wickedness, he can do it for anyone. So why will we spend some time this quarter looking at this man, this nation, these people? Why do we need to know about Israel? Well, Paul tells us a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writes there in that passage starting in verse 1, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ. Here he's talking about what would become of the nation, right? These people would eventually leave Egypt. They would go with Moses. They would be led by the cloud. They would be fed by manna. The water would pour from the rock that they would drink. God takes these people and makes something out of them. And even if he has to do so with them dragging, kicking, and disobeying the whole way. But Paul says here, you know what? They're a lot like us. They drank from the same rock. That rock was Christ. You say, well, Christ isn't in that story. Maybe he is. He was there from the beginning. He was God and he was with God. He plays a part in Israel. That's exactly what Paul is saying here. But I want you to notice the most significant part is the next verse in verse 5. Nevertheless, all these advantages, all these opportunities, all this concerning care, but with most of them, God was not well pleased when they were laid low in the wilderness. Even with God doing all he could, most of them didn't make it. In verse 6 it says, this happened, these things happened as examples for us, so that we do not crave the evil things they also craved. All these things went on. All these stories about Israel are important to us so we can learn from what they did wrong. We like to look and say, well, we wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't have acted that way. We wouldn't have thought that way. We wouldn't have tried those things. But they're not that much different than us. God's trying to help us to see that there is something better so we don't make the same mistakes they did. We don't fall into idolatry like they fell. We don't act immorally like they did. We do not grumble like they did. We do not try the Lord as they did. We do not do those things they did because we see where they lead and what happens. They also show us the faithfulness, the forgiveness, the mercy, and the love that God has. When we learn about Israel, we learn about us. We learn from their mistakes. We see what we could be. We see where we might have gone. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the nation of Israel from the start. We're going to look at it from the very person who got the name from, and his children, and the decisions and the actions that they made. And then we'll go a little farther down the line and see about the nation that they became, and what they did right and what they did wrong. And then we'll go even farther and look into their fall, what they became, the mistakes that they made. But we'll also look at their future. Because it's interesting, because Israel is also something that we all become part of. Not a physical place, not a group of people, but rather the part of God's chosen people. Paul tells in Galatians that when we are baptized into Christ, when we obey, we become sons of Abraham. We become part of this plan that God had all along, not because we have a lineage, but we have a connection. And so, as we said, by looking at them, we can look at us. Because some of the mistakes we are making are some of the mistakes they made. Some of the trials they were facing are some of the trials we may be facing or we will be facing. They are a mirror. They'll help us see ourselves in them. They're examples, so we can see what not to be. But they're also an understanding of how God will treat us and what God will do with us. That night across the river, when Jacob grabbed hold of the stranger that had walked into his area and spent the night trying to pin him down, he had no idea what he was getting himself into. He had no idea who he was striving against. But we can say this one thing for him: he didn't quit. He kept going. And eventually that stubbornness, that resilience, that endurance paid off. He was blessed by God. It was a blessing, in a sense that he already had. He knew that God had a plan for him. But that's when God revealed him that he would change. He would no longer be the person who was taking. He would be the person who would be receiving. He would no longer be the one trying to undermine, but rather the one placed at the top. God was giving him, a legacy. He was giving him something greater. What was he going to do with it? When we look at Jacob, what we see is a chance for us to not make the same mistakes. Jacob oftentimes thought his solution to his problems was his own cleverness, his own wheeling and dealing, his own figure it out himself, but it was never those things that got him where he needed to be. It was God. It took him a long time to figure that out. It took him a long time to trust in God. Even in this situation, he was willing to pray to God, but before he even did that, what he was trying to do: I'll divide my camp, I'll send some bribes for my brother, I'll take care of this on my own. And all he really needed to do was put his faith and trust in God and his plan. Tonight, maybe you're in the same place. You've been trying to deal with things on your own. You've been trying to figure it out. You've been trying to come up with your own way. But it's not going to work. But if we put our trust in God and his plan, if we submit ourselves to his will,